She was a woman the world had trained itself not to notice, precise, composed, quietly holding together the machinery of an empire that did not belong to her. Nia Washington knew how to move through dangerous rooms without disturbing the air. For 14 months, that skill had kept her alive. The meeting on the 42nd floor was supposed to be routine, just another sunset briefing inside a glass boardroom overlooking Atlanta's skyline. Nia stepped inside with her tablet in hand, posture straight, voice prepared, every detail already organized, and the room went quiet, not because she had interrupted, because every man in the room suddenly remembered she was there. 3 of the most dangerous men in the city lifted their eyes toward her. None of them bothered to hide it. Across the table sat the only man who never stared, Park Min-seok, the Korean Mafia boss whose reputation moved through Atlanta like a shadow. A man built like a fortress, silent, immovable, his black suit perfectly tailored over skin marked by old ink and older mistakes. Dragon scales climbed the side of his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. Min-seok did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply looked at her once, then at the men watching her, and said low and controlled, "Button your shirt." The room stopped breathing. Nia's first instinct was anger. Sharp, immediate, and humiliating. To her, it sounded like ownership, like the kind of command powerful men used when they believed everything around them belonged to them, including the women who worked for them. She finished the meeting without reacting, her composure flawless, but the heat of embarrassment stayed with her all the way down the hallway. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew except him, was that one of those men had already been asking questions, quiet questions, where she lived, who she lived with, whether anyone would notice if she disappeared. Park Min-seok had heard those questions hours earlier, and he knew exactly what kind of men asked them. So when his eyes caught the way those same men were looking at her across the table, the calculation was instant. Protection in his world rarely looked gentle. Sometimes it sounded like a command. Sometimes it sounded like a growl. What he did not expect was what happened next. Because instead of shrinking the way most people did around him, Nia Washington walked straight into his office afterward and refused to be small. And that was the moment the careful distance between them finally began to break. 14 months is a long time to hold your breath. For Nia, it was the exact duration of the silence that had stretched between her and Min-seok, a void filled only by the cold, efficient machinery of corporate correspondence and the occasional jarring sight of his name in an industry headline. Standing outside the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, she adjusted the lapel of her blazer, feeling the familiar weight of her boardroom face. It was a mask she had. Perfected, chin tilted at a precise angle, eyes clear and unreadable, a smile that was polite but never reached the ears. Behind those doors sat the man who had once known the girl behind the mask. Min-seok had always been a fortress. While Nia used her composure as a shield, he used his as a wall. In the early days of their partnership, she had prided herself on being the only one with the blueprints to his inner sanctum. They had built an empire on late-night takeout and shared data sheets, their chemistry a volatile mix of intellectual rivalry and a quiet, domestic tenderness that neither had dared to name. But a fortress, once locked from the inside, is impossible to breach without causing a collapse. She pushed the doors open. The air in the room was overconditioned, carrying the faint, sharp scent of expensive cologne and ozone from the monitors. Min-seok didn't look up immediately. He was leaning over a tablet, his silhouette sharp against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Seoul skyline. He looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The lines of his shoulders seemed harder, his focus more clinical. "The logistics report is on page 4, Nia said, her voice steady. She was proud of that steadiness. It didn't betray the way her heart was currently hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Min-seok finally looked up. His eyes were dark, guarded pools of intelligence that gave nothing away. He didn't offer a greeting, nor did he acknowledge the 14 months of static that had preceded this moment. He simply tapped the stylus against the glass. "The margins are thin, Nia. You're playing a dangerous game with the acquisition." "I play to win," she countered, sliding into the leather chair opposite him. The distance between them was only 6 feet of polished mahogany, but it felt like a canyon. For a second, the mask slipped. She caught a flicker of something in his expression, not anger, but a weary kind of recognition. It was the look of two survivors realizing they were still standing on opposite sides of a battlefield they had both helped create. The history between them wasn't just a timeline of professional milestones. It was a map of unspoken apologies and the heavy, suffocating silence of 14 months. "You've changed your perfume," he remarked softly, his voice cutting through her professional armor. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation, a reminder that he still remembered the old scent and that he was tracking the ways she had evolved without him. Nia didn't blink. She couldn't afford to. "A lot changes in a year, Min-seok. I suggest we focus on the numbers." The fortress remained barred and the mask remained set. The meeting had begun, but the real conversation, the one they had been avoiding since the day he walked out, was still waiting in the shadows of the room, patient and devastating. The boardroom was too small for the ghosts of their past. As the presentation flickered onto the wall, casting a cool blue light over Min-seok's sharp features, Nia felt the familiar itch of his scrutiny. It wasn't just about the data or the projected growth. It was the way he watched her movements, tracking the precision of her gestures as if looking for a crack in the porcelain. She stood to navigate the slide deck. Her voice regained its rhythmic, professional cadence. But the air in the room felt heavy, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Min-seok hadn't looked at the screen once. His gaze was anchored to her, intense and unyielding, a predator waiting for a slip in the grass. "The expansion into the Tokyo sector is non-negotiable," Nia stated, clicking the remote. "We've secured the local permits and the infrastructure is all ready." "Stop," Min-seok interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the gravelly weight of a command. Nia froze, her finger hovering over the button. The other executives in the room, men who had been nodding along to her metrics, suddenly became very interested in their legal pads. The silence that followed was thick, a suffocating blanket that pressed against her chest. She turned her head slowly, meeting his dark, impenetrable eyes. "Is there a discrepancy in the numbers, Min-seok?" she asked, her boardroom face locked tight. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folding over one another in a gesture of deceptive calm. Then his gaze dropped from her eyes to her throat and further down. Nia felt a sudden, sharp prickle of heat crawl up her neck. In her haste to prepare for this confrontation, she hadn't realized that the top 3 buttons of her silk blouse had strained against the movement of her arms, dipping just low enough to be a distraction in the sterile, conservative light of the office. "Button your shirt, Nia," he growled. The words were a physical blow. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a public reclamation of authority, a low, guttural sound that sliced through her professional veneer. The heat that had started at her neck exploded into a vivid, stinging crimson that flooded her cheeks. The embarrassment was visceral, a wave of molten lead that made her fingers tremble as she reached up to the collar of her blouse. She could feel the eyes of the room shifting, not with lechery, but with the awkward, shifting discomfort of witnesses to an intimate execution. Min-seok's fortress hadn't just held, it had expanded to swallow the room. He wasn't looking at her as a colleague or even a rival in that moment. He was looking at her with a raw, proprietary frustration that hinted at the 14 months of silence they had both endured. Her breath hitched as her fumbling fingers found the small, pearl buttons. She fastened them one by one, the click of the plastic against the silk sounding like gunshots in the quiet room. Her skin felt too tight for her body when she finally looked back at him. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of shame and a burgeoning, dangerous anger. Min-seok didn't blink. He simply gestured to the screen with a flick of his wrist. "Continue, from the infrastructure." The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished. Nia cleared her throat, the taste of copper on her tongue, and forced herself to speak through the heat still radiating from her skin. The 3-button command had done what the silent months couldn't. It had reminded her that no matter how high she built her walls, he still knew exactly where to strike to make her crumble. The door to Min-seok's private office didn't just open, it recoiled under the force of Nia's hand. The glass vibrated in its frame, a sharp, ringing protest that matched the high-tensile hum in her veins. The shame of the boardroom had curdled into something far more potent, a cold, crystalline fury that had finally shattered her professional poise. Min-seok didn't look up from his mahogany desk. He was a statue of composure, the lamp light catching the silver of his watch as he signed a document with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a battlefield. "Don't you ever," Nia started, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Don't you ever dare command me like that again. Not in front of them, not anywhere." He capped his pen, the sound a definitive click in the quiet room. Finally, he leaned back, his dark eyes tracking her as she marched toward his desk. He looked entirely unmoved, his fortress as impenetrable as ever. "Your attire was a distraction to the board, Nia. I simply corrected a lapse in your judgment." "A lapse in my judgment." She slammed her palms onto the cool surface of his desk, leaning in until she could see the flecks of amber in his pupils. The scent of him, cedar and cold air, threatened to undo her, but she held her ground. "You didn't correct me, Min-seok. You tried to humiliate me. You spoke to me like I was a girl who didn't know how to dress herself." Min-seok's jaw tightened, a small, telltale muscle leaping in his cheek. It was the first crack in the stone. "I spoke to you as the head of this firm." "No," Nia spat, the word sharp enough to draw blood. "You spoke to me like a patriarch. You spoke to me like my father used to when I stepped out of line. You used that same growl, that same suffocating authority to remind me of my place." She took a jagged breath, her eyes burning with a defiance he hadn't seen in 14 months. "I am your equal. I am the woman who helped you build this shadow empire from a basement in Mappo. I am not a child, and I am certainly not your daughter." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the temperature dropping as the ghost of her father's shadow entered the space between them. Everyone knew the stories of the man who had tried to break Nia's spirit with discipline and silence. To compare Min-seok to him was the ultimate sacrilege. Min-seok rose slowly, his height looming over her, but Nia didn't flinch. He walked around the desk, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. The proprietary flicker was back in his eyes, but this time it was laced with a dark, simmering frustration. "I am nothing like him," Min-seok whispered, his voice vibrating with a sudden, raw intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Then stop acting like you own the rights to my dignity," she countered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "The silence was better than this, Min-seok. If you can't respect the woman I've become, then stay behind your walls." She turned to leave, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She had reached the door when his voice caught her, stripped of the corporate armor, sounding almost human. "Nia." She didn't turn around, she couldn't. "The buttons weren't a distraction to the board," he admitted, the words heavy and shadowed. "They were a distraction to me." The air in the office didn't soften with Min-seok's admission. It grew heavy and stagnant, like the moments before a summer storm. Nia kept her back to him, her hand gripping the door handle so hard the metal bit into her palm. His confession wasn't an olive branch. It was a crack in the dam, and she could feel the cold pressure of everything they had suppressed for 14 months beginning to seep through. "Is that supposed to make it better?" she asked, her voice brittle. "That your lack of control is my responsibility to manage?" She finally turned, expecting to see a flash of regret or perhaps the familiar arrogance of his fortress. Instead, she found him standing by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lonely figure against the glowing grid of the city. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the street level, 30 floors down, where the black sedans circled like sharks in dark water. "It wasn't just the buttons, Nia," he said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory register that made the breath hitch in her throat. He turned then, and the intensity in his gaze was no longer about corporate dominance. It was primal. "Do you remember the man in the gray suit at the back of the gallery during the auction last night? The one you thought was just another bored investor?" Nia frowned, the transition from their personal friction to the cold reality of their world making her head spin. "The third man. I noticed him. He didn't approach." "He didn't need to," Min-seok said, taking a slow, measured step toward her. The space between them vanished as he closed the distance, stopping only when he was close enough that she could see the tension radiating from his jaw. He spent the entire evening asking questions, not about our projected earnings or the merger. He was asking about you. Nia felt a phantom chill skip down her spine. What kind of questions? Min-seok's eyes darkened, a flash of something possessive and dangerous flickering in their depths. He wanted to know where you live now. He wanted to know if you still took the late train from the office or if you'd finally hired a driver. And then, Min-seok paused, his voice turning into a serrated growl. He asked who would miss you if you didn't show up for the morning briefing. The silence that followed was absolute. The third man wasn't a rival. He was a threat, a shadow sent by the ghosts of the empire they had disrupted. The realization that she was being hunted didn't scare Nia as much as the look on Min-seok's face. He looked ready to burn the city down to find the man who had dared to speak her name with such casual malice. "I didn't button your shirt to hide you from the board," Min-seok whispered, his hand hovering near her waist, never quite touching, yet the heat of it was unmistakable. "I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of those eyes, those specific eyes, seeing even a fraction of what belongs to my memory." Nia's boardroom face finally crumbled, leaving only the raw, terrified girl who had once trusted him with her life. The predator in front of her wasn't her father, and he wasn't just her boss. He was the only man who knew exactly how much she had to lose. "Who is he, Min-seok?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out then, his thumb grazing the silk of her collar, just above the buttons he had forced her to close. "He's a ghost from a past I thought I'd buried, and he's making a mistake thinking you're unprotected." The realization didn't hit Nia all at once. It settled over her like a slow, rhythmic tide. It started with the Tuesday morning briefing. The lead analyst from the logistics firm, a man named Hwan who had spent the previous session eyeing Nia's neckline with a slow, wandering insolence, was gone. In his place sat a woman with a sharp bob and a clinical, no-nonsense delivery. Nia didn't think much of it until Thursday, when the junior architect from the redevelopment project was suddenly replaced by a senior partner twice his age. By Friday, Nia sat in her office, staring at her digital calendar as the invitations flickered and updated in real time. It was like watching a master strategist scrub a map clean. One by one, the men who had lingered a second too long in her presence, those who had offered her a lazy assessment, rather than a professional greeting, were being systematically deleted from her orbit. She didn't need to ask who was holding the eraser. Min-seok's architecture of protection was silent, efficient, and utterly terrifying. He wasn't just guarding her from the third man in the shadows. He was sanitizing her entire world. He was pruning the edges of her professional life until only those he deemed harmless remained. It was a cold, calculated possessiveness that wore the mask of security. Nia stood and walked toward the glass partition that separated her office from the executive suite. Through the transparency, she saw Min-seok. He was on the phone, his face a stony mask of concentration. His fingers tracing the edge of her file. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. There was no apology in his eyes, only that dark, proprietary intensity that had been simmering since the boardroom confrontation. She pushed through the door, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic protest against the marble. "My 2:00 p.m. with the venture capital group has been rescheduled," she said, leaning against his doorframe. "And the lead consultant for the Tokyo merger has been sent back to the regional office. Care to explain the sudden staff turnover?" Min-seok didn't lower the phone immediately. He finished his sentence in low, clipped Korean, then set the device down with a deliberate softness. "They were redundant, Nia. Their contributions didn't match the standard of this firm." "Is that what we're calling it now?" Nia's voice was a whisper, laced with the heat of her growing realization. Redundancy. Or was it the way Hwan looked at me during the presentation? Or the way the consultant tried to take my coat? Min-seok rose, his presence filling the room with a sudden suffocating gravity. He didn't deny it. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory, until he was standing just inches away. The scent of cedar and cold air enveloped her again, a familiar trap. "I told you," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly at her pulse. "The world is full of men who think your brilliance is an invitation. I am simply ensuring that the only eyes on you are eyes that understand the cost of looking." The boardroom face she had worked so hard to maintain felt brittle, ready to shatter. He was rebuilding the walls around her brick by brick, and for the first time in 14 months, Nia couldn't decide if she wanted to tear them down or hide behind them. "You're suffocating me, Min-seok," she breathed, though she didn't move away. "No," he corrected, his hand ghosting near her cheek, the heat of him a promise and a threat. "I'm making sure there's nothing left for them to take." The silence of the office at 11:00 p.m. was usually a sanctuary, a vacuum where the hum of the HVAC system served as the only heartbeat. Nia sat at her desk, the blue light of her monitor washing over her tired features. She had stayed late to prove she still owned her time, a silent rebellion against Min-seok's tightening grip. But the air felt different tonight, thicker, as if the oxygen was being slowly pumped out of the room. Then came the sound. It wasn't the loud, cinematic boom of an explosion. It was a series of muffled, rhythmic thuds, pop, 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 like the snapping of dry kindling or the heavy staple of a construction gun. Compressed cracks. They were distant, echoing up through the elevator shafts from the lobby levels far below. Nia's breath hitched, her fingers freezing over the keyboard. In the world she and Min-seok inhabited, you didn't need to be an expert to recognize the sound of suppressed gunfire. She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the sudden stillness. The floor felt cold beneath her feet. She looked toward the executive suite, expecting to see the silhouette of the fortress, the man who had spent the last week pruning her world into a safe, sterile garden. But Min-seok's office was dark. His coat was gone. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had left 20 minutes ago for a late-night summit in Gangnam. She was alone. "Mr. Yun," she called out, her voice barely a thread. Mr. Yun, the night security lead, was a man of few words and iron discipline. He should have been at the station just outside her glass doors. When no answer came, Nia stepped into the hallway. The motion sensor lights flickered to life, casting long, jittery shadows against the marble. She found him slumped against the reception desk. Mr. Yun wasn't moving. There was no blood at first glance, just the unnatural angle of his head and the way his radio hissed with a terrifying, empty static. The architecture of protection had been breached. The men Min-seok had systematically removed from her calendar were nothing compared to the shadow that had just walked through the front door. Nia backed away, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The elevator bank at the end of the hall chimed, a cheerful, mundane sound that felt like a death knell. The digital display began to climb. 28, 29, 30. She scrambled back toward her office, her mind racing through the blueprints Min-seok had once made her memorize. There were no more buttons to fasten, no more boardroom faces to wear. The third man was no longer a question asked in a gallery. He was a presence ascending the building, and the only man who claimed she belonged to him was miles away, unaware that his sanctuary was currently being dismantled. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. As the elevator doors hissed open at the end of the corridor, Nia ducked behind the heavy mahogany of her desk, pulling her knees to her chest. The silence returned, but this time it was predatory. Steps approached, slow, heavy, and deliberate. They weren't the hurried strides of a savior. They were the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where she was hiding and exactly how much she had to lose. The heavy mahogany of the desk felt like a tombstone against Nia's spine. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was a living thing, hungry and sharp, vibrating with the metallic scent of the elevator's inner workings. Then a shadow stretched across the plush carpet, elongated and distorted by the moonlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Nia," a voice rasped. It was Min-seok's velvet growl. It was a dry, papery sound, the voice of the man in the gray suit. "Hide and seek is a child's game. And we both know you aren't a child anymore." Nia squeezed her eyes shut, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle the jagged sound of her own breath. But before the shadow could round the corner of the desk, The air in the room didn't just change, it shattered. The sound of the office's secondary service door slamming open was like a thunderclap. There was no warning, no cinematic dialogue. There was only the blur of a dark coat and the sickening, wet thud of a body hitting the glass partition. Nia lunged upward, her heart nearly stopping, to see Min-seok. He hadn't left for Gangnam, or perhaps he had never reached it. He stood over the intruder, his hand wrapped around the man's throat with a terrifying clinical precision. The third man was gasping, his heels drumming a frantic, dying rhythm against the marble floor, his eyes bulging in a face that was rapidly turning a bruised purple. Min-seok didn't look angry. He didn't look like a man driven by a hot, righteous fury. He looked like a machine. Nia stared at his face, and a fresh wave of ice settled in her marrow. It was the coldest thing she had ever seen. His eyes were devoid of light, two black voids that had moved beyond human emotion into a space of pure, predatory calculation. This wasn't the man who argued over logistics or teased her about her perfume. This was the wolf that lived inside the fortress, finally unleashed. Min-seok, she whispered, the name a plea she didn't realize she was making. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the man whose life he was slowly, methodically squeezing away. "You asked who would miss her," Min-seok said, his voice so low it was almost a hum. "You should have asked who would come for you." With a sudden, violent shove, he hurled the intruder toward the window. The man slumped into a heap, gasping for air that wouldn't come fast enough. Only then did Min-seok turn his head toward Nia. The transition was jarring. The void in his eyes flickered, the frost receding just enough to let the proprietary heat return, but the ghost of that coldness remained, a reminder of the lengths he was willing to go to maintain the architecture of her world. He walked toward her, stepping over the debris of the struggle as if it were nothing more than a discarded file. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. Instead, he hovered over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "I told you," he breathed, his chest heaving with the only sign of exertion. "I am nothing like your father. He wanted to break you to keep you. I will break the world to keep you whole." Nia looked at him, the dragon who had saved her from the wolf, and realized with a sinking heart that the fortress didn't just have walls. It had a cage, and the bars were made of the very protection she had craved. The adrenaline didn't leave Nia's system. It simply turned to lead, dragging her down until she was sitting on the floor of the darkened office, her back against the cool mahogany. The intruder had been dragged away by men in suits who moved like shadows, leaving no trace of the violence that had just unfolded. Min-seok didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance for Mr. Yun. He simply sat on the edge of his desk, the silhouette of his shoulders blocking out the city lights. The silence was different now, hollow and heavy with the scent of ozone and the iron tang of blood. Min-seok's hand was resting on his knee, his knuckles bruised and swollen, but his face had returned to that terrifying, static calm. "You think this is about power," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. "You think I'm building a cage because I'm afraid of losing my prize." Nia looked up, her boardroom face long gone, replaced by a raw, searching vulnerability. "Aren't you? You've spent the last week erasing every man who looks at me. You just nearly killed a man in front of me." Min-seok stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Han River which cut through the city like a dark, serrated blade. He reached up, his fingers tracing the collar of his shirt, and for a moment Nia thought he was going to adjust it. Instead, he unbuttoned the top 3 buttons, the same number he had commanded her to close in the boardroom, and pulled the fabric aside. In the dim light, Nia saw them, not scars from a fight, but ink. Small, precise characters tattooed into the hollow of his neck, just above the collarbone. "Gang," he whispered. Nia's breath hitched. She had heard the name in whispers, a footnote in the rumors of his rise to power, a sister who had vanished before the empire was ever built. "My empire isn't a palace, Nia. It's a grave," Min-seok said, his voice stripped of its corporate armor. "My sister didn't have an architecture of protection. She had a brother who thought the world was a safe place for brilliant women. She was better than me. Faster, sharper, kinder. And because I didn't see the third men of the world, the ones who ask where a girl lives and who would miss her, she became a statistic." He turned back to her, the coldness in his eyes now revealed as a deep, ancient grief. The predator Nia had feared was simply a man haunted by the ghost of a girl he couldn't save. "I don't own you," he said, stepping into the light so she could see the raw, jagged edge of his expression. "But I will not let your name become a mark on my skin. I will not stand over another grave built from my own negligence." The weight of his confession hit Nia harder than the violence of the night. The walls he had built around her weren't just for her safety, they were his penance. He wasn't her father trying to crush her spirit. He was a man trying to outrun a past that had already taken everything. Nia rose slowly, her legs shaking, and moved toward him. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink on his neck. The dragon wasn't guarding a treasure, he was guarding a wound. "You can't save everyone, Min-seok," she breathed. "I know," he replied, his hand finally closing over hers, his grip tight and desperate. "But I will save you, even if you hate me for it." Monday morning arrived not with the sharp, panicked breath of the previous week, but with a quiet, deliberate exhale. The office was pristine, the glass partition replaced and the marble polished until it shone like a mirror, reflecting nothing of the blood or the shadows. Nia stood before the mirror in her foyer, her hand hovering over the silk of her blouse. For months she had dressed as a soldier, for the last week she had dressed as a ghost. With a steady hand she undid the top button. Then the second. It wasn't a provocation, it was a reclamation. She walked into the office with her chin at its familiar, precise angle, but the boardroom face felt lighter, more like skin than a mask. As she passed the security desk, she saw a new team, men and women who looked professional but lacked the suffocating, proprietary edge of Min-seok's personal guard. The architecture was still there, but the doors were no longer barred from the inside. She reached the executive suite and found Min-seok already at his desk. He wasn't hunched over a tablet or barking orders into a phone. He was simply watching the door. When she stepped into his line of sight, his gaze immediately dropped to the open collar of her shirt. Nia didn't flinch. She didn't reach up to hide the skin of her throat. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 14 months the static between them was clear. She saw the flash of the old instinct, the protective growl beginning to form in the set of his jaw, but then she watched it dissolve. He looked at her open collar, then up at her face, and he saw the woman who had survived the night, the woman who had looked into his coldest eyes and didn't run. He saw that she wasn't gang and she wasn't a memory to be buried. Min-seok stood, but he didn't cross the room like a predator. He stayed behind his desk, his hands resting flat on the surface. The tension that usually radiated from his shoulders seemed to have bled out of him, replaced by a weary, honest peace. "The Tokyo merger files are ready for your final review," he said. His voice was no longer a growl, it was a conversation. "I'll have them on your desk by 5, Nia replied. She turned to leave but stopped, looking back at the man who had built an empire on a grave. "Min-seok," he looked up, the amber flecks in his eyes catching the morning light. "Thank you for the walls," she said softly, "but I think I'd like to see the view for a while." A ghost of a smile, the first real one she had seen in over a year, touched his lips. It wasn't the smile of a CEO or a protector. It was the smile of a man who had finally put down a burden he was never meant to carry alone. He nodded, a simple, respectful gesture of equals. Nia walked back to her office, the 2 open buttons of her shirt fluttering slightly in the draft of the air conditioning. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a void. It was a space, wide and open, waiting to be filled with something other than secrets and ghosts. She sat at her desk, picked up her pen, and for the first time in 14 months she didn't hold her breath. She just worked.